Here we go. We're on, Daphne. Okay, welcome to Senate Education, Wednesday, January 19th, 1:30 in the afternoon. Senate Education is being joined by House Education this afternoon to talk with Secretary French and Dr. Levine about the rollout of new guidelines for our schools as it relates to COVID-19. So thank you both for being with us. We really appreciate it. We know your time is pressed given everything you have going on. So the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Dan French, Secretary of Education, and Dr. Levine and I spent a lot of time together. So Commissioner Levine, if you're okay, I'll start, and I'm sure he'll chime in if I say something wrong or just to embellish what I'm saying. But good afternoon, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to both bodies at the same time. I think it'll be useful in that regard to provide you an update on our pandemic response. Just to back up a little bit in context, early this morning, I did send out some sort of what we call the foundational guidance documents behind this new approach. I'm not going to speak directly to them, but I thought it might be useful for you to have them. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But in terms of context, as you know, we've made a change in our pandemic response. I think it's fair to say there's been three elements to our pandemic response in K-12 education since the very beginning of the pandemic. One is vaccination. A second one is contact tracing and the testing. And a third are the mitigation recommendations that we provide to school, otherwise known as guidance. Last year, of course, we didn't have vaccination when school opened, and we really didn't have testing for a while. So we put a lot of emphasis on the mitigation recommendations for schools. And I forget how many pages that ultimately resulted in, but it was rather extensive, well over 200 pages of elaborate guidance. And this is where we describe sort of a layered approach because we didn't have any other tools in our toolbox, so to speak. And sometime around November, we implemented surveillance testing, PCR surveillance testing, and then it was only later in the spring when vaccination came online that we had all three of these layers present. Of course, going into this school year, vaccination by far and away the most important of these three approaches. In Vermont achieving a higher vaccination rate than most states, we relied heavily on vaccination to see us through the opening of school. And therefore, our mitigation recommendations were fairly minimal. And we adopted contact tracing and testing as we did last year because we saw them to be successful tools, and we had a lot of operational experience implementing contact tracing and testing, and that's how we started school. Delta, of course, proved exceedingly challenging for us to manage and for schools to manage in that regard. And I think, particularly sometime around October or so, we started to observe, say, the operational challenges, particularly with contact tracing with the elevated case counts that we saw from Delta. And we heard from school nurses in particular that it was unsustainable. I think the word unsustainable started to emerge on a consensus basis sometime around Halloween. And again, due to the higher volume of the cases associated with Delta. On the other hand, we were unwilling to let go of that strategy because we knew it worked. So we did what we could to support people. And sometime after Halloween, Test to Stay came online, which certainly was a useful strategy in a lot of ways. I think the first time we really deployed antigen testing in particular in schools. But from an operational perspective, Test to Stay added another layer of complexity and operational complexity to school districts because nurses, to a large extent, were in charge of both doing contact tracing and Test to Stay. And there is a relationship between those two approaches that required a lot of work on their part. And that's how we entered the holiday season. System greatly fatigued. Wondering what was going to come next. And I would say, by the way, of holiday, because I still remember sometime around Thanksgiving, I think it was the day after Thanksgiving, I learned of the first time of this new variant, Omicron. And I can remember the feeling coming back into school that Monday. And there was a broad sense of deflation across the system as we contemplated, how this variant would unfold. And we didn't know a lot about it at that time. So we certainly paid attention to what the experience was in other countries like Israel and so forth to understand to what extent the variant was more contagious, to what extent it caused more severe illness, and to what extent it could evade our vaccination. But we didn't really know. And just amazing how quick Omicron spread around the world. Just phenomenal to reflect upon that, because we really didn't know anything about it going into December. And it was really in that 4-week period in December into January that we started to react to it. And of course, we had a major school vacation in there, which was desperately needed by folks. But it was over that vacation that we also saw the CDC start to make adjustments to its isolation and quarantine recommendations. Vermont had been contemplating, I would say, similar revisions, but Omicron, I think, forced everyone to start to move quicker. And we reopened school after the holiday period, basically in the same disposition we were before the holiday, doing contact tracing, test to stay, and so forth. And we saw immediately more school closures as a result of staff availability issues as Omicron was starting to play out in our landscape. And sometime shortly thereafter, our EPI team came to conclusion and consensus that contact tracing and surveillance testing were going to be inadequate to address Omicron, largely because they're too slow and they're too time intensive. So once we had that sort of public health consensus behind us, we had always had operational concerns about maintaining and sustaining contact tracing and test to stay. Once we had that broader public health consensus, that really shifted our thinking and required us, I would say, to make some adjustments. So we met with our teams internally, with the pediatrician community, our infectious disease experts, and Dr. Levine can certainly color that process in a bit. And we formulated an outline of what we thought would be a good approach, which I'll describe here in a little more detail. But basic theme is to more broadly deploy antigen tests into the community and not just try to protect the perimeter of the school per se, but seeing schools function more as distribution centers. Because one of the reasons that we wanted to make the pivot, as we saw with contact tracing and the test to stay approach, is those systems were only good during the school day per se. That, you know, there's a lot that went on in the communities that schools didn't really have control over. So when we, for example, would hear from superintendents that students sent home to quarantine were not really quarantining, they were out in the community and so forth, it just highlighted this idea that we were working so hard to protect the school, but really we had to pay attention to what was going on in the broader community, particularly with Omicron. So the larger theme here is a more broad deployment of antigen test screening that gives everyone more actionable decision making in a more timely basis, more information, and so forth. And that's sort of the broader theme of what we're endeavoring to do. As I started to outline that, met with various stakeholder groups, and particularly the superintendents asked that I produce a heads up memo, if you will. That was the memo that went out on the first Friday. And that was in large part due to their interest in having a signal as to where we were going next, because it was pretty clear we couldn't stay where we were. And as you know, that memo had caused some concern on the part of Vermont NEA, and also your need to hear testimony on that. My point in reaction to that was, there were a lot of questions about the public health rationale for making this change. And all along we said, Dr. Levine and his team would be more than happy to meet with groups to explain that, as they've been doing, as they've done throughout the pandemic. They've always been very generous with their time. But we subsequently had to translate that signal and change into specific guidance. And those are the documents I shared this morning. So there's a couple components I would just highlight. Again, I'm not going to read them in detail, but just to highlight and sort of, I'll stop and give you also an update of where we are now, then turn it over to Dr. Levine for a bit. But the basic idea is that schools are stopping the contact tracing process as we did it before, which was sort of a one-off process, a lot of labor and intensity process on their end to track folks down and build line lists and so forth, in favor of doing this broader notification process. And really, I would say, to pivot off the new isolation and quarantine guidance, that the key distinction for schools is who's vaccinated and who isn't vaccinated, because that's how our guidance rolls out relative to the use of antigen tests. So schools stopped doing the contact tracing, and then what was test to stay previously is now called test to home. Basically, schools distribute these kits, and parents are responsible for administering them at home. So that's a key element of what we're doing here. Schools are no longer sort of with that disposition of protecting their perimeter, if you will, but in this theme of more broadly deploying the kits into society and putting the responsibility on parents and so forth. There's a trade-off there. Yes, we lose control of some of the data, what we gain from it is a broader deployment of these tests. So we think that more will compensate for that difference, but also more to the point, allows us to keep pace of the speed of Omicron. Another key element of that, which sometimes gets lost in the conversation, is that we're also deploying kits for nurses to do back to the sort of more traditional clinical role that they have. So both students and staff will emerge as symptomatic during the school day. Nurses will have the tools in their office to screen individuals on the spot, either using antigen tests or what we call LAMP tests, either of which provide some confirmable information on what to do next, so to speak. So that's a key element. I would say the other thing that what I just described is largely supply driven. So a key element of what we're working on now is to ensure that we have the supplies necessary to do this. That was as we had confirmation of orders and our supply quantities and so forth. We wouldn't have embarked on this change in policy if we didn't have a strong sense of security in that. But actually, putting tests on the ground in the form of schools, that's been an ongoing issue. We did basically with our guidance, we said to schools they could begin to make this change as soon as they felt they had adequate supply to do so. We did an initial deployment out of our existing stock of supplies last week and over the weekend. We have large orders hitting the ground right now as we speak. So a lot of schools you'll see implementing this new approach this week. And I've seen a number of requests from superintendents and so forth for supplies. So I know they're working on and sort of implementing this new approach. Why don't I stop there and see if Dr. Levine wants to provide a little more context, and I'd be happy to engage in conversation on this.
You've done a really thorough job, Secretary French. I'll just emphasize a couple themes. Theme one, I guess, would be responsiveness to changes in data and science. And I think we've done that every step of the way in the pandemic, and certainly done that in our evolution of the guidance to schools now. Because in the end, we don't only utilize the data and the science, we actually help create it on the ground as well. And consider this to be another part of that process. We already know that this virus has morphed into something that is far more transmissible, far more rapidly transmissible, highly contagious, and that practices of the past, and the past could be just 2 months ago, are no longer as relevant in the present. Contact tracing, you've heard, is really, a foundational epidemiologic and public health tool, and it isn't disappearing. There are plenty of other diseases we can use it in very effectively, but with regard to this disease, it's just not nimble enough, and it's not responsive enough in as rapid a fashion to a situation that can evolve very quickly in terms of identifying cases. Obviously, testing is something we're not abandoning. You've heard about the approach we're taking, but we are, again, I'll use the word evolving from a testing policy in the schools that was much more surveillance driven to one that is now more management driven and case driven and driven to the extent of how to keep kids in school immediately. All of the things we're doing are really to satisfy what I guess I could term the prime directive, which is obviously in-person education for all of our children. And that means you need to have very rapidly responsive protocols in place to allow that to happen. I won't get into all of the issues around the problems that occur when you don't have in-person education and you're more in a hybrid or a remote aspect, but I think we all understand where the downfalls of that have been. So we were very quickly confronted with Omicron, as was the world and the country, and we needed something very flexible, something that allowed us to be very nimble. And again, evolve but not discard successful public health practices. What the secretary said about the school as a part of the community is particularly germane here. I think a lot of times from the viewpoint of some of our public as well as parents, schools were feared to be the locus of transmission of disease and almost a dangerous place to be in. And I do not believe any of the data we've collected during 2021 supports that thesis at all. In fact, with the abundance of mitigation strategies layered on, including vaccination, masking, etc., the schools have actually probably been a microcosm of being a safer location, not a more dangerous location. But we have learned very quickly with the most recent variants that the schools are a very much an integral part of community. And when disease enters the school, it is just a reflection of what is going on around the community that surrounds the school. You'll note that a lot of this new guidance is in parallel with new guidance regarding isolation and quarantine and what those mean, and the implications of the number of days that have gone by for people in each situation. Some of this guidance is more pragmatic in terms of it will achieve greater compliance of a population if you can safely return them to their workforce, to their learning environment, to wherever in a shorter period of time. And part of this guidance is really, I would say, recognition of the fact that we are dealing with different variants now. And this latest one, we feel that the safety factor is still built in as we try to relax the guidance, because we, again, have this as a layered approach, not just number of days you're out, but number of days plus you have no symptoms, plus you've not had a fever, plus you will wear a mask when you get out, and plus you may have some testing associated with that to assure you're no longer infectious. A lot of this is really a, if you will, gradual transition towards endemicity. I don't want anyone to think that I think we're at endemicity today. This will evolve over the next several months, and hopefully we will be there March, April, who knows when, which will be much more welcomed, I believe, by all. To give you a flavor of the kind of thing that Secretary French was just talking about, you know, we're literally talking about 400,000 antigen tests coming into the state yesterday. Now, not every single one of those is going to the school environment, but the majority are. And those are the kinds of purchases that are being made. Those are the kinds of supply chains that we're actively pursuing all of the time to keep this program as successful as possible. And that's why it couldn't just be launched on the Friday where the preview was given, but we needed to ensure that a whole bunch of schools had already had deliveries, and that the schools that were still requiring deliveries had a light at the end of the tunnel, so they would know within the week that this would become reality for them. So I will stop there as well, because we've made a few independent points and we've made a few points in common, and hopefully you've gotten enough to work with.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm just going to kick it off with a question. I think this would be for Dr. Levine. So the 4,000 that are coming in, and you said most of which are going to schools, do you have a sense of the next, shipload? In other words, are we going to be okay? One of the things I think we're recognizing is, as you're pointing out, is if the nurse's office can have as many as they need and families can have them at home, that's the ideal. People can get tested if they don't test at home, and we understand that some families may not test at home for one reason or another. Somebody comes to school, they run a fever, and the nurse has one there as well. So are you feeling comfortable around the number of tests? And I guess the follow-up would be, how do families get these tests? Is it on them to purchase them, or are these being sent home?
So the answer to the first part is there are several supply chains where the purchases are made and the delivery date is to be determined.
Okay.
So they will be coming, but the question is exactly on what date. And there are, much like we did with testing in the very beginning way back 2 years ago, we learned that you need to have a diversified portfolio. And so the portfolio here is diversified in terms of the types of antigen tests, the supplier, et cetera, so that we can try to exploit as many pathways as possible. The second question is that this is actually, I think Secretary French referred to it, the school becomes a distribution center. So let's say there's a classroom where a case has been identified. The entire classroom is notified that there was a case and that everyone in the classroom was a potential contact. The nurses will be able to distribute antigen tests to the members of that class, the numbers of tests based on the vaccination status of the student that the student takes home and then utilizes in the home environment with the appropriate guidance. So there's no purchasing, there's no needing to have something. It's sort of connected to the fact that there's a need for that set of classmates to have testing done.
So it really is, there's a tight, it's a very focused approach. In other words, it's not as though, we're sending home thousands of these tests just to kids every day. It's really when an incident occurs, the need is recognized, those students will get tests sent home with them and they'll have to test before they come back, that kind of thing. I don't know if Secretary French wants to jump in there, but Dr. Levine, if you want to.
He looks eager to jump in.
Yeah, I'd say not quite, but
Okay.
it is. I think it's important to situate this specific school policy in the broader policy that we're invoking for the state. This idea of broad deployment of testing. So we'll be airing. We're using schools as distribution point because it's a very convenient way to provide testing to families. Coincidentally, it also allows us to enable keeping schools open, one of our policy priorities. But the logistics behind that is really part of a larger societal interest in deploying these tests widely. So there's going to be, as we're seeing now, some conversation around who gets the test and what have you. But basically schools, particularly I would say in the next couple of weeks, and I was going to call that out previously, I think Dr. Levine would agree, we're in a specific moment. It's important to acknowledge as well is that endemic is off on the horizon, but right now we're surfing this Omicron wave that's in front of us, where we will err on the side of putting more tests out as a discrete strategy to navigate this particular moment. So I think, there'll be some of that iteration with schools, like, when do the tests go out and so forth. And our policy certainly describes, again, the big fork in the road is vaccination status. But there'll be a general inclination to put as many of these out as possible as the supply allows us to do that.
Senator Hooker, and then Senator Chittenden, and then Representative Webb, I'll look to you if there are any House questions. Senator Hooker.
I just wanted a clarification on who was getting the tests. And it was my understanding that if a child were vaccinated, they would get one to have testing 5 days later. And if they weren't vaccinated, they would get multiple tests to be tested daily. Is that still the case?
Yeah, pretty much. I think, we sometimes say one or two. It's, they come in packs of 2 tests. So a student who's vaccinated will get one kit of 2 tests, one ideally to be administered on day 4 and one on day 5. It's important with the antigen tests that they're done in a sequence. And if you remember test to stay, the idea of a student participating in a regular sequence of testing, that's very similar to what's going on here for the unvaccinated, in that they would be given enough tests to take them through 5 days. And every single one of those days, if they test negative, they would still be allowed to attend school that day. And they would do that through a series of days. Again, these are for what we call presumed contacts. So these are not people who are symptomatic or have been tested as having the disease. These are folks that have been in the proximity and so forth. So this allows us to maintain some alertness relative to their symptomology and contagion.
Senator Chittenden.
So you are right, though. The vaccination status is the branch point. And I might add, in terms of conserving tests, we have a very highly vaccinated student population. particularly at the higher age levels that have been eligible for some time now, because they're all in the 70+% range and higher. Even our 5 to 11 year range, we're approaching 60% for at least one dose, which may not seem like a lot to people on this testimony, but the reality is we are like the second place state is not even in reach of 60% at this point in time. It's way behind that. So Vermont parents have really stepped up in a big way to get their 5 to 11-year-olds vaccinated.
Thank you. Senator Chittenden.
Whoops.
I'm sorry, Senator Hooker, why don't we follow?
I'll wait until Senator Chittenden's finished. This
Are you
is
sure?
the topic, yeah.
Okay. Senator Chittenden, you're up.
Really quick. So I definitely agree that our primary objective is in-person learning. And I think we would all agree that we want safe in-person learning. What I'm seeing in the documents that we just received shortly before this meeting, as I've skimmed them, I'm seeing some distinction in grade levels. So I see some characterizations around kindergarten or elementary versus high school, middle school. I know this is focused on testing and other guidance, but I'm getting a lot of questions, and our committee has brought up the topic of remote or remote hybrid or remote if able. Could you give us an idea of your thinking and if there's any delineation in your mind as a parent of a high schooler, a middle schooler, and an elementary kid? I understand the differences in in-person learning and the importance across those different grade levels. As you're fielding remote questions, remote days that might be counting as school districts struggle with staffing, is there some distinction or thoughts that you would be willing to offer these two committees as to where you are with those exceptions and otherwise as these school districts struggle to maintain be open?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to draw a through line between the testing and the new approach we have, test at home, relative to I think the issue you're raising, which is the waiver issue in remote learning. So there is a distinction, I think, in our new guidance around elementary and high school, and this is what's playing out honestly right now on the ground. And this has to do, Dr. Levine would characterize as the evolution of contact tracing and what we'd call the response notification approach. And if you could imagine, many of our elementary schools are under 100 students. They're relatively small, and we have a lot of those in the landscape of Vermont. The response notification in that type of school is going to look different than, let's say, Champlain Valley Union High School. If you have, I'll say 100 kids in elementary school, largely one grade per class, versus a 1,000-student high school, with lots of different classes during the day, and how the schools approach the notification process that we are describing in our guidance is going to be totally different. Literally, in that small elementary school, they're going to be able to say grade 4 had a case today, and if you're vaccinated, do this. If you're unvaccinated, do that kind of thing. Whereas in the high school, you're going to have far more cases because you have a larger student population in the context of Omicron, and your students are mixing through the day much more dynamically. So you're not going to be able to say, Science 9 had a case, because you probably have multiple sections of Science 9, to begin with. But more to the point, that student is going through multiple classes, and many of our, I would say, not even smaller high schools, a lot of high schools, those students are mixed at different grade levels. So you can't even say grade 9 had a case. So I think the notification process at the high school will evolve, particularly at this 2-week period. I'll call it 2-week period. That's don't quote me on that, but that's, I'll say this specific moment of heightened Omicron cases where it's going to be very dynamic, and we're erring on the side of getting the tests out. I think the notification for high schools will become more general. There was a case today in these grades. It's almost like a daily thing. It'll be out there, and if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, pay attention. That'll be the fork in the road again. But in terms of, if we bring that over to sort of remote learning, and I think it is what we're seeing playing out, particularly after the holiday, and it's honestly playing out across all sectors of our economy and our society. Staff availability, I think, is going to be sort of the more unique feature of Omicron than perhaps Delta. Particularly with schools with Delta, we saw schools closing because they had cases in a grade, and that grade went home in quarantine or what have you. Again, the inefficient approach to contact tracing that caused a lot of that to happen. What we're seeing immediately with Omicron is staff availability issues, and meaning staff are either ill themselves and have to quarantine isolate, or they have to stay home, take care of children, that kind of thing. It can have a ripple effect. And we're seeing that now play out across all, like I said, all sectors of our society. So the first point I make with that is that there was an assumption last year when we say go remote, that staff are available to teach in remote. If the staff are ill or needing to do something else, they're not necessarily available to teach. So that's the first thing I would mention. And then, yeah, to your point, I think it's an important distinction that remote learning as a whole is far more efficacious at the high school level than it is at the elementary level. So the idea of courses, we talk about learning management systems, which are the technologies that deliver remote learning. They're organized generally around courses, not classes like an elementary school that one teacher teaches multiple subjects or courses in a single day. So we know high school, much better application of remote learning. And, to draw a distinction between Delta and Omicron, what we saw in the fall, and it didn't really get covered that well in the media, but high schools for a large part were very stable this fall, largely because their higher vaccination rate. Most of what we struggled with Deltas was an elementary school phenomena. The high schools were, as opposed to last year where they were in hybrid or what have you, by definition, due to our distancing requirement, high schools are very stable this fall, relatively speaking. So as we're coming into this time of the year, we're thinking about what the Delta experience where we had classes going out on quarantine and so forth, but in many cases, elementary schools were able to keep open for the other students that were present. So we have a definition in our, this gets to our attendance definition. Our attendance definition in the statute talks about 50% of the students being present. So in the fall, many elementary schools, they might have had fourth grade out, but the other students were present, so they were able to count the day as an attendance day. So that was the fall experience. Now we're going to see more school closures, and we're already starting to see that again as a result of staff availability. So it's provoked more of the conversation around remote learning. I would say that provocation of that question is different than it was last year. The concern last year was about the safety of the school building. Is it safe to be in the school? And there was a lot of political interest locally and people saying we're going to remote because I don't want to send my kid to school. It's not safe to be in school. That's not the context in which we're reacting now. Firstly, I'm not sure we have significant number of absences from the fall, but now certainly we're seeing them play out. But this is precisely the time of year when we invoke the waiver process that is available to schools. So I think, my inclination right now is to let that process play out. The superintendents are well aware of how that process works. We've used it successfully for the last couple of years, very flexibly to react to COVID circumstances. So the question becomes not so much do we put remote learning in place, it's the question of are schools going to be making up days or not? Will they receive a waiver for days in which they were not in session, meaning they don't have to make them up if they fall below the minimum number of required days, or are they going to have to make them up? And right now, it's to draw the through line back to the fall. It's not clear to me what the pattern of closure will be this year yet, but we are entering that time period where the waiver process comes online. The superintendents know that'll be available to them at the end of January. And I suspect we will see a lot more waiver requests for the last 4 weeks of this 4-week period in January than we'll probably have seen for the whole fall, just because of the staff availability issues that are really causing more havoc in the system than what we saw at the elementary level in the fall. So at any rate, that's sort of a long-winded introduction to the concept from a legal perspective or regulatory perspective. And just to echo on Dr. Levine's earlier point, also in the background is from an educational standpoint, our keen interest in keeping kids in school, because they're unlike, we can talk about Delta and Omicron as sort of being unique phenomena. We now have an experience of a cumulative negative impact on students that goes back a year at least. And we have to be really cognizant of that and also really be focused on trying to move the system forward to attend to their needs. And, particularly those students that were at risk prior to the pandemic are no doubt more at risk now. And we have to be really, I think, as you're seeing across the world and across the United States, really focused, are doing our best to keep the kids in school and keeping the schools open as best we can.
Okay, let's shift to the House for 2 questions and we'll shift back. Representative Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That actually is sort of a segue to my question. Given that we have a prime directive of keeping kids in school, which I think we all share pretty deeply, and with the change in some of the data you're collecting no longer really being useful, what data are you collecting? And I think in particular, as we see the number of school days decreasing, the number of times that you need to switch to remote, are you collecting the data on school days lost, schools lost? Why? Is it due to staffing? Is it due to, those wonderful Excel sheets that we'd love to see? That will help us have a better understanding of what our losses are during this time to help us respond going forward.
Yeah, we'll have two data points on this, and I think you're aware we haven't, like last year, we haven't been collecting data on a monthly basis to monitor hybrid, in-person, remote, because this year everyone's been in person essentially. We'll certainly see the waiver request data come forward, so we'll see requests from districts that have fallen below their minimum number of days, and we'll have an expedited process for that. That'll allow us, give us some insight as to the reasons why they were closing. And then last week, I stood up a data collection that recommends school districts report to us when they're closed. So we've been collecting that. We'll start reporting on that. That's more specific to this, I'll call it the Omicron wave that we're in. It's not so much about learning loss. It just gives us a sense of the operational context of what's going on as we seek to deploy tests to schools and so forth. A lot of logistical considerations that we're managing are predicated on schools being open. So those are the two primary data points. We don't have any other statewide sort of attendance information. It's a very decentralized school system. We also don't have any statewide academic measures other than SBAC. You might remember last session, I was an advocate for requiring a benchmark assessment be implemented statewide. That would have begun to give us some foundational information, particularly at the elementary level, but that was not ultimately sustained through the legislative process.
Representative Webb, another question.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to follow up with you on additional data, but I won't take the entire time here. Representative Brady here, who's, as you may know, is a representative, a school board member, a teacher, and a parent. So she brings a pretty broad perspective here. So Representative Brady.
Yes, thank you. Relative to testing, I know it's a supply issue, but do we have a sense of when schools might have the tests for this shift to test at home and be able to be handing them out?
This week is what we've described. What we were able to do at the tail end of last week was to distribute some supplies that we already had in stock. But the larger shipment in particular, Dr. Lean mentioned the 400,000 tests that just arrived in Vermont yesterday. So that's being distributed as we speak. So I would expect districts will be able to enact the new policy this week.
And what about testing for teachers? Where does this, all of these shifts, what does this mean in terms of test availability, access for teachers?
I'm not sure about your question. I think, what we saw originally was some concern about the maintenance of PCR surveillance testing. Is that your question? Yeah.
Well, it seems like teachers won't have access to PCR testing now, and I'm unclear as to whether they will have access to what will hopefully be a much bigger supply of antigen testing. If that is more responsive, if teachers have concerns, if they know they're in classes where there are cases, which obviously they are, will they have access to those tests as well?
Well, firstly on antigen, yes, and and I'll have Dr. Aveen chime in a second if he's interested in this. The antigen tests, absolutely, those are being deployed at school. Again, we're going to be erring on the side of putting them out into the broader community as much as possible. Teachers are specifically mentioned in our protocol, particularly if they're symptomatic. But again, nurses also have the ability to screen folks. That's another element of our guidance. This is where I'll invite Dr. Levine to comment a bit about, because what I've been talking about is drawing the distinction between PCR technology, which is a very useful technology. It's still very much the gold standard, versus a specific application of it in the context of what we call surveillance testing, which is no longer as efficacious in this moment of a fast-moving variant. So the idea of surveillance testing, once a week you go in and get tested, isn't necessarily going to be helpful to us in the context of a fast-moving variant. And initially, when we were signaling the rollout of this guidance, I heard from districts, and the question would be, well, we found that useful in the past. It helped identify a few asymptomatic cases in our community, and all that's true. But the actionable nature of that information taking so long, it takes probably 2 days to get the results back. And if you're only doing it once a week, it really doesn't help with the broader idea of managing the pandemic and Omicron specifically. So surveillance testing will sunset here at some point. So teachers will not have access to it. On the other hand, I've heard from school board members who are interested in that, less so this week. And some of them have asked, for example, can we use our ESSER funds to do it on our own if we wanted to? ESSER funds are certainly available to districts to pay for testing, but we've been trying to stay focused on communicating to them why surveillance testing is you shouldn't, if you had a sense of security from that, you probably shouldn't as much. But maybe Dr. Levine, you can chime in here and correct some of my statements or embellish them.
Far be it for me to have to correct anything you said. First of all, in the guidance we provided to schools, we did include not just teachers, but staff who are presumptive contacts. So they are still eligible to obtain the same kits on an as-needed basis based on there being a contact as identified as one. With regard to the surveillance testing, I almost look at this as like the way people look at their retirement plans. And they've kind of gotten used to something. I know that's probably a sensitive discussion here amongst the legislature, but they've gotten used to something and then something changes. And one thing gets taken away, another thing gets added. And you're like, well, but I was wedded to the thing that was taken away. And I think that's what's happened to surveillance testing is people got very wedded to it, felt very comforted by it. And it provided a sort of early warning system, knowing how asymptomatic transmission can occur at such a high rate with any variant of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, certainly with the Omicron variant. But it really just isn't the way to go now at a time when you're trying to identify things on a very rapid basis and be able to sort of stop the lines of transmission quickly. And not have a delay built into the entire program. Now, having said everything I just said, there's going to be a point where Omicron is now vanishing away, and we're hopefully in a long interlude between Omicron and whatever's to follow. And we will want surveillance testing programs to occur. Whether they occur in teachers or in schools or in other settings across society, is yet to be determined, but there will still be surveillance testing going on in some manner in society, but it's not going to be at a level that you've been seeing it at prior to the last few months, where we were very, very intent on having a very large system stood up. It will be a much more selected system looking at much more high vulnerability, higher risk populations. So it doesn't mean it's gone forever, but certainly it isn't going to be valuable now. And it's way less valuable than the pivot we're making towards the rapid testing, especially at a time of high community prevalence of virus.
Thank you. Senator Lyons.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been very helpful as far as schools are concerned and greatly appreciated. I think the guidance for schools, it's one of the things that you said right up front, Secretary French, was that schools are the safe place to be. And it is because of the masking that's in place and now the testing that's in place and previously contact tracing and now more incident tracing. So that really is very helpful. I'm going to take my question to outside of schools, to Dr. Levine, and knowing that what parents and children do out of school determines if kids can be in school learning. And so, they're in school, they're safe. I mean, it's just great. And the transmission is attenuated because of the masking. Kids are vaccinated, you're getting tested. It's awesome. It's still a problem. And I guess the problem is coming in from outside. So Dr. Levine has just predicted my question. How can we ensure that we are blocking Omicron from transmission, knowing that KN95 and other high quality masks actually block Omicron better than they do Delta? So what are we thinking about keeping the virus from actually walking into the school in the first place?
Yes, I did predict your question. Um, Not that I needed to prepare an answer ahead of time, because really mitigation, the answer is always the same. It's all of the same things we've been preaching since day one. So stay home when sick being highest on the list, which is a problem. And I think when you talk to parents who maybe don't trust the system we've described here today, or when you talk to work sites and people are lacking trust, it's because of the fact that there's still a portion of society that doesn't respect the stay home if sick rule and perhaps exposes people to a higher risk than they might otherwise have. Obviously, the next things on the list are also very predictable in terms of attention to respiratory etiquette and hygiene. Clearly, we advocate for masking at times of CDC substantial or high levels of community transmission, which we have been in for God knows how long now and will be for the foreseeable next number of weeks, certainly. Hopefully not next number of months, but we will find that out. With regard to the quality of the masks, there's a lot of nuanced messaging going on. Some of it, I think, confusing everybody, because as recently as a day or two ago, Dr. Walensky was saying again, I just want you to wear a mask. It doesn't really matter. A mask is better than no mask, which is true. Although we are trying to still very much emphasize that a one-ply cloth mask is really not going to give you the protection you want, and you're fooling yourself more than anyone else if you follow on that pathway. It doesn't mean everyone needs a KN95 either, but apparently the president thinks so, because every household is going to have the opportunity to get one sometime in the next 2 weeks, I believe. And it'll be up to the state to help determine how we distribute that, unless the federal government devises a system using pharmacies or what have you to do that. So I think high quality masking and consistency in masking is critical, again, to protecting the schools in the way you described. And of course, we can't end this discussion without talking about vaccination. We are doing incredibly well in Vermont, but again, our booster rate in aggregate is probably in the 60-65% range at this point for those who are eligible to be boosted, which is leading the country, so we can be proud, but it's also not going to really cut muster here at this point in time with such a transmissible virus. We really need that booster rate up even more effectively. It's occurring, thousands of Vermonters per week increasing those numbers, but it still takes time when the majority of the state are vaccinated Vermonters, and you get several thousand in a week, maybe let's call it even 5 or 10,000 in a week. Still takes you a long time to get up to the 400,000 that might be eligible to get those boosters. So all of the above will keep our society as safe as possible. And in this time, I would add, gathering size is important still. I think people have gotten that message, given at every holiday that we've lived through recently. They may not have abided by it, but they've heard the message. And the reality is, again, while community transmission is high, multi-household gatherings of any significant size are not really going to be conducive to helping the situation. Schools have it under control. They actually can gather people from multiple households in ways that work better than what happens in most people's social gatherings, which is usually unmasked, eating, drinking, and in closer contact with one another. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, more or less. The issue around what's coming next is obviously always on our minds, and we don't need to go into the public health data at this point, but it just, I think, really critically important, as you have said many times, to know that Omicron really isn't mild. And right now it's the kids who are being infected in hospitals. We aren't seeing a change in our hospitalization. We're seeing very high rates, and ICUs getting filled up. I heard this morning that they actually opened up a surgical suite to expand the ICU at UVM. So we're all concerned about this. We don't want to put fear in people's minds, obviously, but we want to ensure that what schools are doing maybe get carried out into the community a bit more. So I'll leave it at that. And I know you and I have talked about this before, so thank you.
I'm going to
Appreciate it.
ask that we start now a bit of a lightning round. I mean, we're talking short answers and direct questions only because I know there are so many questions from the House. I have them, and senators. So with that, Senator Hooker.
Just a quick question about masks. In the guidance, it says schools should require universal masking. And, in the legislature, we differentiate between should and shall. So what is your interpretation then of that?
That's unchanged. Our recommendation is schools should require. So we are not requiring them at the state level, and I don't have the authority to do that. But we are asking school boards to leverage their authority to require them. And as you know, I think that's been very successful, except in one school in the state.
Okay. And if I could just, another one, I had a concern from a family about sports and kids who are playing sports who are unvaccinated. Can you address that in any way?
Yeah, our recommendation is that all athletes should be vaccinated. There is a bit of it's an area we're working on now relative to our new guidance. I think VPA is a big player in terms of putting out guidance for high school athletics. It's not an area where we've weighed into heavily this year. And we're seeing some confusion play out around implementing our new guidance around response testing, if you will, and what that means for athletics. So that's an area we'll delve into a bit. But right now, that's more of a question for VPA, but it's not being consistently implemented around the state. Different high schools have different approaches.
And we do have a masking recommendation regarding athletes as well.
Yep.
How can we get K95s into people's hands, into students' hands quickly?
It's not a problem. I mean, supply-wise, it's not a problem, and I don't think it's a money issue either. So it's an education issue, and districts have ready access to supply. We're standing by to help them with that, but I don't think the state will be. Our response would take several weeks. We can certainly help, but I think districts can solve that pretty immediately.
That's a good reminder. I forgot about that. Representative Webb.
Yes, Representative James has a question.
Thanks. Since this is the lightning round, I'll pick my first question. I understand the problems with sustainability of test to stay. So I have two questions about test to home, both of which you've mentioned in passing. Is there anything you can do to try to address the loss of data that's going to happen, as the tests move to home? I'm worried about that. And I'm also wondering what, if anything, you can do about families who really are unable or unwilling to comply.
Yeah, I'll take the second one. I was going to jump in on Senator Lyon's earlier question, and I think it's important to acknowledge, firstly, that schools do not operate well when they're positioned in conflict with families. And a better part of the wear and tear, when we talk about contact tracing not being sustainable, it's that conflict that really contributed to the lack of sustainability, meaning nurses having to call people up every single day and not necessarily get cooperation. People got tired, of cooperating, if you will. And so first thing I'd say is, this shift in policy isn't necessarily going to resolve some conflict that existed prior to the holidays during Delta. That conflict and that willingness to comply was always there. I think what we're trying to do now is acknowledge that a better part of the issue, to Senator Lyon's question, is really not necessarily inside the school building, but it's how do we get out into the communities? And that's a key element of the strategy, is how to deploy this, make it more doable. So schools aren't necessarily in the policing of a public health policy, if you will. It alleviates that pressure from the schools. It puts school nurses in particular back in sort of their more typical clinical role. Yes, it does put responsibility on parents, and yes, not all will comply. But the saturation that we're going to achieve with this broad deployment of antigen tests, we think kind of compensates for that aspect of it. The data is one we're messaging. We're going to have to let go of some of that data, and that's hard for us because we rely heavily on that for our decision making. But back to the point on surveillance testing, from my perspective, a key strategy for surveillance testing, and I will say, to my knowledge, I think we're the only state that deployed surveillance testing regularly last year in schools. That gave us a sense of what was going on in the communities. As Dr. Levine said, we already know the virus is strong community transmission right now. So having insight into that doesn't necessarily help per se. But we are talking about other metrics. I think you'll hear us talk more about the supply of antigen tests, for example, or the uptake. So there are going to be some other measures that we can sort of speak to. And we'll certainly, the broader public health apparatus, the public health and physicians' offices and so forth will still be reporting that type of information. And we'll certainly, as we have throughout the pandemic, focus tightly on hospitalization and ICU usage as indicators. But the case count is going to be a hard one to, I don't see how we're going to be able to continue with that as we err on the side of a more broad deployment of the testing. But
I think
answer.
there's just one additional part of the question that I don't think you answered, Secretary French. And I think if the implication is there are going to be families that are going to be challenged by doing at-home testing, built into the protocol is the opportunity for the school nurse, who we've unloaded in many ways with a lot of other burdens, but there's opportunities for the school nurse to become directly involved with families who do find this to be a challenge and may need some help in administering these tests. So that is a niche that's been carved out, if you will.
Representative James. I think Representative James had.
I did have another question. Just about the waivers, I just wanted to understand, as I understand it, Secretary French, you've had the ability to grant these waivers for a couple of years now. Is it that every year the waiver process doesn't begin until January? That's just its regular timeline? That's one little piece I've been missing.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you a concrete example, I had a superintendent reach out to me this morning or maybe yesterday. It was yesterday about pipes freezing. This is I haven't gone back and catalog waiver requests, but I would say a lot of them are about pipes freezing this time of year. So the waiver process historically is set up to deal with the second half of the year. The assumption is that maybe some things occurred in the first half of the year, and school districts typically would make adjustments like shortening a vacation or adding days on to the end of the year. But as you know, we don't know how snow days play out, and school districts are required to put 5 additional days on their calendar for contingency relative to snow days. So some districts start tapping into that. So they don't really know what their trajectory is going to be until the second half of the year. So that's when the waiver is designed to be invoked. Okay, we've done that analysis. We're going to run out of time. I need to request a waiver. So yes, it's January, end of January, February.
Thanks.
I'll tell you, French, you're not great at the lightning round. I'm sorry. I mean,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I mean, you're okay. You're okay. You're okay. Yeah. But I'll
give you years of being in school board meetings. I can't help myself.
And if Vermont Digger could do that headline tomorrow, I mean, I'd pay them for it. French fails the lightning round. Sorry. Other questions, Representative Webb?
I think we're good in our committee at this point in time, so appreciate
the one thing I'd like to ask is child care centers. I'm not sure if this is it. I suspect both of you are involved, but I do know a colleague of ours is concerned about early childhood programs. I mean, we're all concerned about early childhood programs. So if you could just say a word about that.
Yeah, I think, pre-holiday, that concern started with our rollout of Test to Stay. We had signaled we were going to extend that out to private childcare, and that was our plan prior to getting caught up in the Omicron piece. Though you will notice we have deployed that out to childcare. So they're very much on our radar. We haven't forgotten about them by any means.
Okay, other questions? This is an incredibly informative hour. We really appreciate the two of you coming in. Do either of you have final comments for us that you think we should know, something we didn't cover or that's in the guidance documents that you don't want us to lose sight of?
No, I appreciate your support. It's a dynamic situation, to say the least. I think, I've just underscored the fact, this 2 week, keep calling it a 2 week period. We
Yeah.
are at a critical moment where we're really erring on side of getting stuff out the door and really trying to push forward. Because I think if the trend plays out like we are seeing in other parts of the country that started earlier than us, where there is some light at the end of the tunnel here.
Great.
And my only additional comment is just to recognize this has been a pandemic long, and certainly most recently, an even further increased collaborative effort between the Agency of Education, the Department of Health, the pediatricians of Vermont,
Yeah.
public health, the pediatric infectious disease community in Vermont, the
Agency of
schools,
Transportation.
Yeah.
the Agency
right.
of Transportation
Huge,
for delivery of tests, and for educators all across the state. So this has really been an important collaborative effort, and I think it's been done very transparently, and hopefully it will only matter for a few weeks more to a month or so more. Keep your fingers crossed.
Indeed. Again, thank you both very much. I don't see any other hands raised. So Representative Webb, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Doctors French and Levine, thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
So committee, one of the, we're going to wait a minute for Jim to join us, but does anybody have, one of the things that I think everyone will be looking to us for do we have outstanding concerns that we would want to take legislative action on? And I don't know if there's something out there that we're hearing as it relates to schools. If there's any questions or comments, Senator Lyons?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the remote learning piece, the waiver piece. Is there anything that makes sense for us to weigh in on at a policy level? I don't think we want to weigh in on the testing and the Department of Health decision-making, but certainly on the accumulation of snow days, remote days. Is there something that we can do to ensure that our schools and aren't going to be extending their timeline into July and August? That's my concern. We talk about kids having mental health issues right now, and one of the best things that can happen is that they get out into after school and other activities, not stay in school. I'm sorry. Everybody needs a break, and our kids probably need it more than anybody, and our staff. Yep.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think we can have them back to have a little bit more of that conversation for certain. And we're going to be talking with approach to make sure that we're all on the same page with, after school, and making certain that when students are out, they can transition to something, that they're just not at home.
Not just out. They need support, and they need people around them when they're out. They can't I was going to say relapse, but they can't get worse. That's what we want to avoid.
Right. No, I agree. Senator Shinden.
I share your concern, Senator Lyons, and I think with Senator French's closing remarks, it's a dynamic situation. I feel like we just need to keep monitoring it and possibly take action, but it seems like they're very responsive and they're following, and he seems to be ready to issue the waivers as necessary. So I don't see action now, but I think we need to pay attention over the coming month.
Anyone else? Any immediate response or comments that we need to? Senator Persia.
On the after school, it might be good at some point. There's no urgency, but to have Holly Morehouse come in and talk about what they're planning. And I know she would be able to give us a good update on that.
It's a great idea. I have a note to have Senator Kitchell in to talk about some of these things, but I think your point's a great one. Let's get Holly in first to give us an update on where things are at and what might be needed going forward. Okay, great. Mr. Desmarais, thanks for joining us. So the schedule is switched around a little bit. We will hear in probably later this week from the Agency of Education. Their CFO will be in to take us through the governor's recommends. In the meantime, rather than now. And so we're going to hear from Jim Demaray. He's going to share updated language on S219. We're then going to have a walk through S139, the mascot bill that was introduced last year. And I know colleagues have reached out to me wanting us to consider that. And then at S248, we're going to hear from Senator Hooker and Jim and Elizabeth St. James on the state colleges and universities on governance. And then we'll shift at 3:30 to refugees residency and in-state tuition with Elizabeth St. James again and Tom Little from BSAC. So with that, Jim, do you want to just walk us through the new language?
Sure.
To 219.
Yep. Good afternoon. For the record, Jim Demaray, that's counsel. And let me just, if I could share the screen. There you go. Thank you. Okay. So can you see this document?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So this is your committee amendment to S219. There have been just a few changes from the last testimony. So I'll just scroll through and highlight them as I go. No changes to the findings and purpose. No changes to section 2, which is your whole certification process. We have deleted the old section 3, which was the amendment to the BPAA. That's now gone. And so now section 3 is the repeal of the employment provision that allows some degree of discrimination. And then we go to dual enrollment. And what is here, I spoke with Emily further about this. This is all the same, findings and purpose. The language we agreed to, we're coming off this language again. We're talking about eligibility for dual enrollment. So it's got to be a Vermont resident and the student has to be enrolled in these various schools. And 3 says an approved independent school in Vermont to which the student's district of resident pays publicly funded tuition on behalf of the student. That is current law. We've broken out and kept that provision rather than striking it. And we've added the provision that Emily brought to the committee yesterday that is also someone who is a resident of a non-operating district enrolled in an approved independent school. So the question I think must be, why did we do it that way? So remember that this language here introduced by Emily is being protective. So if a school district denies public tuition and the student is therefore on private tuition, they are picked up by this provision. So it picks up the group, that group at least. And of course, it picks up in Maine all those sorry, let's try that there. Let me go back to this language here. So we kept this language up here. Sorry about the confusion there. We kept this language here as it was about independent schools being has to be paid publicly funded tuition. We kept that there as it was because we realized that with Emily's language below, it would exclude if an operating district gets a petition to send a student to another district on tuition, the operating district will be on public tuition. But if we just use this language here from Emily, they will not be picked up because it only applies to non-operating districts. So this language here that we had before will pick up that very narrow circumstance for operating districts. And that's a very complicated explanation to confusing language. So let me take your questions because I'm not sure if I can explain to you better than you can ask me about this.
Jim, were you going to take it down, or what's the?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Why don't we
yeah,
clear it off since it's on? There we go. So yeah, Senator Chittenden.
I think it's pretty straightforward, Jim, but my question, I guess, is on page 7 of 7. I'm not quite seeing the difference with bullet 2, a public school in another state or an approved independent school that is designated as this public secondary school for the student's district of residence. Why do we need 4? It seems like 2 would catch those students that have been sent to an approved independent school by their school district.
I see. I have to pull it back up. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem.
But maybe it's a non-point. I just feel like they're a little redundant. But as I like to say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm the new guy around here.
Yeah. Well, so go back to the text of where you are, if you would.
Page 7 of 7, bullet 2, line 1 of page 7. It just seems that already would encompass the new yellow language, lines 10 and 11. But
oh, okay.
It's an approved independent school.
Well, a public school in another state is not an approved independent school. So that is a different category of school.
Okay.
Right. Senator Lyons.
Oh, no,
Okay.
I was just gonna say, I didn't know who the new guy was.
So just so we know, process. I mean, we're still a ways away. You know, we still need to hear from a lot of people on this. This is going to go to just so you know, Jim, to judiciary. I am going to make the request that this make it its way down there. I think it's important for judiciary, given some of this back and forth on some of these issues, that they see it. And so hopefully we can at least get them a final draft maybe in the next week or so, even as we contemplate things a little bit more. Anything else on this at this moment? Yes, Senator Lyons, please.
No, I guess it's a question about the legal authority we have in our Ledge Council, and Jim has done such a significant amount of work on this.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that, Jim, are you going to represent the legal background for this, maybe along with the AOE council
For the
Judiciary Committee?
Oh, I'm happy to provide whatever you like.
No, I just want to make sure that you are there when it's taken up in judiciary.
Oh, sure,
because you're the expert on this.
I'd be happy to be there.
Well, I mean, there isn't anyone else in Ledge Council who has now accumulated the background that you have on this.
Probably not.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And my request, by just, I really would like to run it, just have them, and they may not take it up in any serious way. They may even say, hey, no, this is in a way we wouldn't like to see this, but yeah, it just giving them a pass, the opportunity, I think makes some sense. Okay. Okay, why don't we shift then to Senator Hooker? Senator Hooker, S-248, I believe, is the bill. Why don't you give us a little context? And I think there are other individuals from committee who are also co-sponsors, but the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm Cheryl Hooker, Senator from Rutland County, here to introduce S-248. This bill adds faculty, staff, and student representation to UVM and to the Vermont State University systems to support and democratize governance by the universities by their most experienced and knowledgeable stakeholders. Over 26% of public universities in 13 states have faculty representation on their boards. Shared governance guarantees that key stakeholders and those most knowledgeable about the university's operations can help guide it. So this bill simply adds to the boards that are already in existence in those entities, and it attempts to make sure that people who are on the board are really in the know about what happens on the campuses. First and foremost, the state needs to adequately fund public higher education in Vermont so that our Vermont students have an affordable option. Public higher education is an economic engine for the state. We heard the governor talk about it yesterday when he talked about 1,000 kids coming out of UVM a year, and 50% of them who are from out of state are staying here. They're staying here and they're becoming part of the fabric of our communities. It's especially important at this time when Vermont is starving for skilled workers. One way the transformation can occur to make sure that these workers stay here and start raising their families here is to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table of the college system. These people coming that we're asking to be included on these boards have direct knowledge of the needs and the problems of the campuses that they work on. So the top-down corporate model that's in place now for boards seems to not really take into consideration the reality of the day-to-day workings of the systems. And this is what we would hope to do by adding faculty members, staff members, and student voices. Student voices have always been a part of this in our state, and we're just looking to increase that voice. Faculty and staff are people who know what happens on those campuses from day to day and can give a realistic view of what's necessary. So we're hoping that this bill will be something that can be implemented. It doesn't cost a lot, and it may have long-lasting effects. So, and I think, is Elizabeth here too?
Yeah, I think Daphne's probably getting Elizabeth. We jumped around a little bit here on the agenda. I apologize. But so this adds board members to each of those boards?
Correct. And it would add, it would have 3 board members appointed by the governor for the Vermont State College system. That would be a decrease of 2. Currently, the governor has 5 appointees. For UVM, there would be 3, would maintain. Student trustees, there would be 3 student trustees on the Vermont college system, and that's an increase of 2.
Who determines the faculty and staff membership?
I think that is something that, you'd have to ask those who are putting this forward. It came from the Labor Task Force. So it's a group of faculty and staff made up of people from the state college system. So I believe it would be from their Labor Task Force, but I can't say for sure. So that would be something that I'd have to look into.
Senator Terenzini.
Thank you, Senator Kibbe. And I was just going to add that, I'm proud to attach my name to this bill. Senator Hooker did a lot of work on it. And I really actually think it's pretty neat that although it only has 4 co-sponsors on the bill itself, I know there's more support for it, but right now it's tripartisan at the top of it. And I think this bill can get support from all different angles of the Senate. And I think that's what's pretty neat about it, because we all care about our state college systems and UVM and want to see these schools just prosper. And I think this type of representation on the board is really important, especially after what we've just seen the last 12 or 24 months of this transformation of the state college system, which a lot of us could argue has not been seamless or well-rounded, especially down here for Castleton. So.
Okay.
And if I could just add something
Please.
to that, the faculty feel that, there is a need for transformation in our system. I think we all agree to that. The question is, who's going to have a say in this? And they feel that they've been left out of the process. So this would be an attempt to bring people to the table so that they could express their concerns and to give that expert guidance that's necessary. The systems tend to rely on outside expertise when we have the expertise right here within our systems that could help to make this transition an easier transition.
So I just have one question is, if faculty and students were on these boards, would there be issues around, I'm just thinking, human resource policies, sharing of salaries, that kind of thing?
Well, for personal issues, boards have specific protocols for executive session to avoid these types of conflicts.
Okay.
So there are boards that already do this, and I'm sure that this protocol would follow the best practices, if you will, of other boards that already have this kind of representation.
Okay. Senator Lyons.
No, that was a question I was going to ask around
Okay.
conflict of interest issues. So if there are policies, would those policies extend to not voting when budgetary concerns, when you're voting for a budget where the budget affects one's own salary? I'm trying to sort it out, but I think that's an important question to ask. And then you're talking about, Senator Hooker, you talked about the need for transformation of our college system that is not taking place. So I'm just wondering what that transformation is. What is the folks who are promoting this obviously have something in mind. It would be helpful just to, if there are people who can testify, to get a picture of what the goal is. What's the problem being solved? And then what's the goal?
Okay, and just to clarify, I think that the transformation that's going on is something that I believe is something that we need. And I think that the people who are asking for this representation just want a voice in that transformation and don't feel as if they've had it.
Okay. But it would be helpful to know what the transformation is that they want to have a voice in. I'm just trying to put it.
Well, there's been talk about, combining courses and remote learning and who's going to be doing what and which campuses. And this is the type of thing that I think needs to be.
So these are things then that they're concerned about that are within a faculty contract or in the other contracts? Or in when schools open and close? I'm thinking of students, that kind of thing.
I would expect that
all of it.
There would be a lot of that, all of the above.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was 2 years ago in the prior committee, we spent a lot of time talking about the state colleges and UVM boards, but it was mainly around gender equality. I don't see the language in there, so I guess they didn't pass. I just remember the committee discussion more than what happened after that. But did that come up at all, Cheryl, when you talked to them about
No, it didn't. This is, again, representation broadly from the faculty and staff, and more representation from the student body. The feeling is that student-facing people on the board will inform decisions and reduce changes that have unforeseen consequences. Many of the board members, they're willing to serve and may or may not have experience with higher education. Many of the board members may or may not ever have stepped foot on some of the campuses that they're directing. And so this kind of firsthand experience is something that the labor task force is looking for.
Yes, Senator Chinden.
So I'm generally supportive of always talking about governance, and I work at the University of Vermont, and I have experience close experience with another governance body not necessarily spoken to in this bill, which has to do with the Faculty Senate, which is distinct from the faculty union. I also want to recognize, if this were to move forward, I'd really want to hear from UVM as to them talking about the subcommittees that they have of the board, which many of them have faculty serving on them. By no means am I against getting more faculty say and faculty involvement on these boards, but I just think if this were to move forward, it's really important to recognize what faculty voice they do have in place now, and then looking for ways to strengthen and to amplify that. So I generally am very open to this conversation, and I know that we need to make sure that faculty, like at the University of Vermont, the Faculty Senate has jurisdiction, primary jurisdiction over the curriculum. But when it comes to working conditions, that falls within the union, but there's a lot of overlap between those two. So I think there are some systems that we'd want to respect that I think the language could be tuned to improve to that. So if this were to go forward, I hope we'd invite UVM to come in and just talk about the board composition, the subcommittees, and how they currently function.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's have Ms. St. James take us through the bill.
Good afternoon, Beth St. James, Legislative Counsel. Can you all hear me okay? Okay.
Perfectly.
I'm using an AirPod for the first time with my laptop, so if it cuts out, please let me know.
And I apologize for shifting the agenda. I hope you.
I signed on as soon as I could. I hope that was okay.
No, I apologize. Yep. My apologies.
Would you like me to share my screen?
Sure.
Can you all see S248? Yes, okay.
Could you make it a little larger?
Yep.
Possibly? Thanks.
There we go. Better?
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so S248, an act relating to the governance of the Vermont State Colleges and the University of Vermont. It begins with the Vermont State Colleges Corporation and Board of Trustees. As you heard from Senator Hooker, who I apologize, I missed most of what she said, but I assume that she talked about the purpose of this bill, which is to increase the number of student trustee members and add faculty and staff trustee members to both the boards of trustees of the Vermont State Colleges Corporation and University of Vermont State Agricultural College. So we begin with the Vermont State Colleges, and we find their Board of Trustees information in Title 16, Section 2172. And the first part of this bill is Section A of that statute, changing the total number of Board of Trustees from 15 to 23. And the bill goes on to look at who those 23 trustees are. So in current state law, the governor appoints 5 trustees. This bill contemplates taking that 5 down to 3. And then the next group of trustees are student trustees. Current state law, there is one student trustee. This bill contemplates adding 2 for a total of 3 student trustees, of whom shall be undergraduate students, and 2 of them shall be undergraduates and 1 of them shall be a graduate student. And then the criteria for being eligible does not change. In subdivision B here, the changes are just for the making words plural. There was 1 trustee to begin with, and now this bill contemplates more than 1. So there's just changes to make certain terms plural. There's no substantive changes there. Again, on page 3, subsection 3, there is just a language change, changing legislature to the more commonly used term now, General Assembly. And then we get into the big changes on line 12, subdivision 5. We're adding 4 trustees who are faculty employed by an educational institution operated by the Vermont State Colleges Corporation. The 4 faculty trustees shall be members of and elected by the unions representing faculty. The unions shall convene a convention to elect members to 4-year terms expiring March 1st. Vacancies for any cause shall be filled by the unions convening a convention to fill the seat, and the term of the person so appointed shall expire on the next following March 1st. For any election, each union shall have 1 delegate for every 20 members they represent, with a minimum of 1 delegate for each union. The next addition is on page 4, subdivision 6, and this is an addition of 4 trustees who shall be staff employed by the Vermont State Colleges Corporation. The 4 staff trustees shall be members of and elected by the unions representing staff. The union shall convene a convention to elect members to 4-year terms expiring March 1st. Vacancies for any cause shall be filled by the unions convening a convention to fill the seat, and the term of the person so appointed shall expire on the next following March 1st. For any election, each union shall have 1 delegate for every 20 members they represent, with a minimum of 1 delegate for each union. So for the Vermont State Colleges, this bill contemplates adding 2 student trustees, 4 faculty trustees, and 4 staff trustees. It also contemplates taking the governor appointments from a total of 5 down to 3, for a total of 23 trustees. Again, change here on page 4, line 9, subsection B is the section says that appointments by the governor, elections by the General Assembly, and then we're adding the new additions in student, faculty, and staff elections shall be made with consideration of geographic distribution of members to prevent an unfair focus on any single college or campus. The word campus is inserted to take into account the fact that there are multiple campuses. And then there's no changes until we get to page 5, subdivision 3. Again, instead of just the governor or board appointing folks, because there would be people elected through unions, this is just an all-encompassing term, appointing or electing authority of the removed trustee. And then there is an addition of a term limit. No member shall serve more than 2 terms. And section 2 of this bill amends section 2173 in Title 16, which contained a total here. And so we needed to update that total. So in addition to the 22 elected and appointed trustees that are outlined in 2172 above that we just went through, the Board of Trustees shall include as a member the governor of Vermont. So that takes us to the total of 23 that's mentioned at the very beginning of that of 162172. Any questions before I go on to the transition section? Okay. Section 3 is session law. So this is providing for a transition for these new trustees to be appointed and come on board. And so because it's a temporary piece of legislation to allow for that transition, it doesn't need to be in statute. So it provides that on or before July 31st, 2022, new members of the Board of Trustees of the Vermont State Colleges Corporation, with the exception of the 2 new student members, shall be appointed or elected under Section 1 of this Act. And then it goes into Subdivision 1 to say 2 faculty trustees and 2 staff trustees shall serve an initial term of 2 years. So they're 4-year terms, and we're limiting their initial term to 2 years. The first year of service of these members shall be a partial year commencing on August 1st, 2022 and ending on March 1st, 2023. The remaining year of their term shall be a full year. And then Subdivision 2, 2 faculty trustees and 2 staff trustees shall serve an initial term of 4 years. The first year of service of these new members shall be a partial year commencing on August 1st, 2022 and ending on March 1st, 2023. The following 3 years of their terms shall each be a full year. So what this is meant to do is to stagger the terms so that the board does not have vacancies in those positions all at the same time. And then to address the student trustees, the transition section is subsection B, on or before September 15th, 2022. The 2 longest serving gubernatorial appointees shall be replaced with 2 student trustees in accordance with Section 1 of this Act. These student trustee members shall serve a partial term commencing on September 15th, 2022 and ending on March 1st, 2023. And then here is our some information about folks who are currently serving in the new term limit. Current members who have already served more than 2 terms at the time of enactment of this Act may finish their term, but shall not be eligible for reappointment or reelection. So if you've already served, 8 terms, you don't get kicked off right away. You get to finish your terms. You would just not be eligible for reappointment or reelection. Any questions before I go on to UVM? Okay. It looks very similar. So the Section 4 of your bill amends Title 16 VSA Appendix Chapter 1, Sections 1-2. The governance of University of Vermont and the state agricultural college is contained in an appendix to Title 16. So that's what that app means. Again, here in the first section that we are amending is Section 1-2. Again, the first amendment is on line 16. It is to the total number of members. So this bill takes the total number of members from 25 to 34. The rest of this section that remains untouched are the gubernatorial appointees and the legislative appointees. And again, you'll see this term trustees was capitalized at one point in time. That's not in convention with our capitalization conventions now. So there are some kind of updates to the language with no real substantive effects that you will see. Again, and then there are self-appointing board members with trustees appointing folks themselves. And the first section where we are amending the composition of the Board of Trustees of the University of Vermont is page 8, line 3. This bill takes the number of student trustees from 2 to 3, so adding 1 student trustee. And again, wherever there was a difference in the needing to make a term plural, that may have been updated. The next addition is on page 9, line 3. This is an addition of 4 faculty members, so 4 faculty 4 members shall be faculty employed at the University of Vermont State Agricultural College. The 4 faculty members shall be members of and elected by the unions representing faculty. The unions shall convene a convention to elect members to 6-year terms, expiring on the last day of February in the respective year of expiration. Vacancies for any cause shall be filled by the unions convening a convention to fill the seat. The term of the person so appointed shall expire on the next following last day of February. For any election, each union shall have 1 delegate for every 20 members they represent, with a minimum of 1 delegate for each union. There's also the addition of 4 staff members, and the text of that is substantially the same. It's a 6-year term. They are appointed by unions representing the staff. Vacancies will be filled with a convention of the unions through delegates. Again, just a capitalization amendment there. And then for the University of Vermont and State Agricultural College Board of Trustees amendment, this bill contemplates also adding a new term limit. No member shall serve more than 2 terms. This section of the bill, section 5, is the transition for adding the new trustees on or before July 31st, 2022. New members of the Board of Trustees of the University of Vermont State Agricultural College, with the exception of the 1 new student member, shall be appointed or elected under Section 4 of this Act. And again, Subdivision 1 and 2 is essentially the same as what we went over for the Vermont State Colleges. It appoints 2 faculty members and 2 staff members to serve for initial term of 3 years, and then 2 faculty members and 2 staff members to serve an initial term of 6 years in an effort to stagger the appointments so that there aren't giant holes and vacancies at one time. The new student member shall be appointed or elected on or before September 15th. The first year of service of the new student member shall be a partial year commencing on September 15th and ending on the last day of February 2023. The following year of the new student member's term shall be a full year. And then again, current members who have already served more than 2 terms at the time of enactment of this act may finish their term, but shall not be eligible for reappointment or reelection. And right now, the Section 6, the effective date is this act shall take effect on passage.
Questions? Very comprehensive. I think one of the things that we just need to get a sense of, I'd ask committee members to marinate on this for the next couple of days, is where we all are. If this is something we want to pick up, we wouldn't pick it up right away. We'd pick it up sort of as we, after we would finish church and state and some of the waiting work, just so that we know that we can get through some of what I might consider, and I don't mean this in any negative way, just some of the bigger priorities that we've outlined for the session. So unless I see any questions or final comments, Senator Hooker, please.
I'd just like to suggest that, we hear from people who have proposed this, certainly,
Yeah.
and hear from the schools and, perhaps members of the board to get their ideas on it as well. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. And Senator Hooker, if you're as lead sponsor want to come up with a short witness list that we might pick up in a couple of weeks, week and a half or so, that would be great if you'd email that to me.
Thank you.
Senator Perschlick.
Interestingly, the bill in 2020 was also S-248.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and it's about the board trustees, but it's about gender balance. It's a pretty short bill.
I thought that was that passed or not?
It was. I think that this bill didn't pass, but I know we did some kind of omnibus education bills, but they often got in tussles with the House and didn't pass. So
okay,
I guess we'd have to look, or maybe we can ask Ms. St. Jean. That language from S-248 of 2020 did get passed.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind looking into that for us, that'd be great. I think we might also have, I'm thinking it may not have, because it might have, we might have a similar bill on our wall again this year that might have been put on last year by Senator Bruce, and that we didn't get to. So yeah, we can dig into that. It'd be
This
great
was
if you could do that.
Peterson, Ballant, Baruth, and Hardy. For what it's worth.
Yeah. Jim, can you handle coming back at 3:30, since I think we need a break? We've been at it 2 hours. That's okay?
That's perfect.
Great. All right. We'll see everybody at